Well, good afternoon. I'm Vali Nasser, the Dean of the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. And it is my pleasure to welcome you all today to a conversation on U.S.-China relations during a time of rapid change. Geopolitics, economic relationships, and technology, among so many other issues, are transforming at such a pace that long-standing foreign policies and traditional power dynamics are being tested like never before. That, combined with populist and nationalist forces all over the world, including here in the United States, means that what we came to expect of the international order is now open to question. Given the history of Johns Hopkins' size and its establishment in 1943, it is only appropriate for us to ambitiously look forward to how global transformations might once again reshape the international affairs. Furthermore, today's conversation continues an enduring tradition of dialogue on the study of China at Johns Hopkins size. We have long understood and appreciated the importance of China's relationships around the world, and especially its relationship with the United States. Since the Hopkins Nanjing Center opened its doors in 1986, we have shaped over 3 decades of U.S.-China relations through our alumni who have gone on to be global leaders. Similarly, the scholarship of our esteemed experts on China has influenced both policymaking and the private sector, and we are privileged to be hearing from some of them today. Joining the panel discussion will be our own Professor David M. Lampton, the Director of SAIS China, and the George and Sadie Hyman Professor of China Studies. Professor Lampton is one of the leading scholars of China today, and through the years, many students, faculty, and institutions have benefited from his wise counsel and scholarship on China. We are also joined by Sui Liru, the former president of the China Institutes of Contemporary International Relations. He currently serves as senior advisor to multiple institutions for the study of national security and foreign relations. He specializes in U.S. foreign policy, U.S.-China relations, international security issues, and Chinese foreign policy. And it is wonderful to be welcoming him to SAIS today. It is also my great pleasure to introduce Amy Selico. She is the principal of Albright Stonebridge Group and leads the firm's China team in Washington, D.C. Drawing on her expertise in U.S. government, Ms. Selico has deep understanding of non-financial service sectors in China, intellectual property rights, and U.S.-China trade relations. We are also proud to say that she's a graduate of Johns Hopkins SAIS and a graduate of our Hopkins Nanjing Center. Thank you to SAIS China, the Johns Hopkins SAIS Foreign Policy Institute, and our friend, the China-U.S. Exchange Foundation, for supporting and organizing today's event. Finally, I would like to thank and also introduce our moderator today, Dr. John Lipsky, who is a senior fellow at our Foreign Policy Institute and the Peter G. Peterson Distinguished Scholar at the Henry A. Kissinger Center for Global Affairs. Now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Lipsky to the podium. Thank you.
I can assure you I deserve no applause here. I have the second easiest job. You have the easiest job. You get to sit and enjoy a wonderful presentation, I'm sure, by our 3 distinguished speakers. But I'm just here to explain how we're going to go about this. First, we'll hear from each of our speakers in turn. I won't take time to introduce each of them individually. They're all very capable of knowing when it's time to come up, and you're very capable of knowing how this program will unfold. So we'll start with Professor Sway, then Professor Lampton, and then Amy Selico, who just to amplify what Dean Nasser said, not only is a graduate of SAIS and the Hopkins Nanjing Council, but attended, if I'm right, all 3 SAIS campuses, Washington, Bologna, and of course Nanjing. So we're especially proud of her accomplishments. So we will have our 3 speakers present individually, and then I will rejoin you, and they will join us on stage. We'll have a brief discussion and then open to questions from you, the audience. So without further ado, let me just add my welcome. Thanks to the China-US Exchange Foundation, and to tell Professor Sway how honored and pleased we are to have him here with us today. The floor is yours. Thank you. Should be turned on, yes? It's all set. I'll take it.
Thank you very much, Professor Lipsky, and I would also like to thank U.S.-China Exchange Fund and thank Johns Hopkins University. It's very much honorable for me to have this opportunity to have give presentations and have discussions with the very distinguished specialists on China affairs in the United States. My topic today here is about China-US relations, that is to manage the transition and for a new accommodation. There are 3 keywords in my topic today, and they are transition, and management, and accommodation. I think which are also 3 questions, or 3 points of my presentation. Now let me start from the first keyword, transition. Sino-US relation now undergoing a historical transition. The established balance of this relation has been changing because of the evolution of the power equation and the deep interdependence developed between China and the United States, including power structure rebalancing and the vastly growing ties between the 2 countries. This is an unprecedented evaluation process of the 2 major countries, which has brought a number of complicated issues and some uncertainties of the future development. The change of the balance has been driven initially by China's economic growth. The most demonstrative development was in the year of 2010, when China's GDP surpassed Japan's and becoming the number 2 largest economy. Since then, China has consistently strengthened the number 2 position by enlarging the gap, GDP gap with Japan, and narrowing the gap with the United States. Up to the year of 2006, GDP of the 3 countries are respectively 18, 11, and $4 trillion. It is widely predicted that this momentum will continue in the foreseeable future. And China will very likely surpass the US, becoming the largest economy in about next 10 to 15 years. Of course, as China's population is much larger, so its per capita GDP is far behind that of the United States and Japan. The dramatic economic development with high speed consistently in about 3 decades has quickly driven China's modernization process and comprehensive national power to a new level. And equally important, all of these have happened with a parallel process of China's rapidly engagement with outside world. With the tremendous spillover effect, China's peaceful rising has become the most important development in the globalization and the multipolarization process after the Cold War was over. China's rising has changed the parity, or rather special balance, and the dynamics of the relationship between the two major countries. On one hand, America's power superiority and the political predominance have relatively declined, while China's capacity and the diplomatic positivity has been extending. On the other hand, there has been deeply growing interdependent China-US economic relations. But for most American strategists, the first aspect is of far more greater importance and should be taken care of, while regarding the second aspect rather as a sort of normal development. Of course, due to such an attitude, there must be corresponding policy implications. The impact of the changing balance have been reflected on all 3 dimensions of China-US relationship, namely bilateral, the Asian-Pacific regional, and the global issues. Consequently, there has been growing tensions and the new issues between Washington and Beijing. But in my view, the general situation of this newly developing balance has been a mixture of 2 further parallel growing trends, that is, of strategic competition and pragmatic cooperation. This is something unprecedented in the history in terms of a relationship between 2 major powers that I regarded as a kind of new configuration emerging. Now let me turn to the second key word, managing. Observing China-US relations, a relation between the 2 largest economies and the global actors with comprehensive powers. The most prominent and worrying development nowadays is their growing strategic competition. The realism strategists in Washington regard China's rising with its growing capacity, international influence, and proactive diplomacy as a major challenge to US primacy in Asia and world leadership. They advocate strongly that China now should be tackled as a peer competitor. Therefore, a strategy of rollback and hedging is required. The major China policy readjustment has been carried out under the Asian rebalance strategy, including substantial military and economic measures. They are, of course, met by China's reaction to strengthen their national defense capabilities and regional strategic countermeasures. Growing strategic competition between China and the United States lead to more defensive and hedging thoughts and interplays with each other, which cast further negative impact on each other's perceptions of the strategic intentions from the other side. All these make policy coordination more difficult when it is required. At the same time, it is witnessed the third-party factors are becoming more problematic. All these have added more complexity to the situation when close coordination and cooperation are required between China and the United States to tackle the challenges of the regional hotspots. A typical case of such a situation now is occurring in Korean Peninsula, when China-US cooperation is urgently needed to address DPRK nuclear issue. Strategic competition has also constituted the important backdrop of US first-time official intervention into the disputes between China and Japan on East China Sea islands. Such US intervention in the name of taking care of its Asian aligned countries' security against China's sovereignty claimation pose serious challenges to the long-time understanding between the two governments on this kind of issues. Therefore, China could not but raise questions about the roles of US military presence and its alliance system in Asia. That is, if it is going to be an Asian NATO against China. And currently, an influential view in US, very much relevant to the above developments, is that there is a power struggle for the primacy in Asia-Pacific region going on between the US and China. The former is the established power, is to maintain the status quo, while the latter, as a rising power, is to revise the status quo. There is an increasing danger that the competition will develop into a confrontation, a so-called Thucydides trap, like history is repeatedly demonstrated, is of realistic possibility. It seems not so important to debate if such views are really of valuable reference or not, when both sides are making preparations based on such perceptions. The most important thing is to avoid the tragedy happening. Then the possible way out would be either one side change its course as the other side requires, or both sides make necessary strategic compromises. So far, we don't see any such signs that could let us be optimistic enough about the future development. That means what we can do is to manage the strategic competition to ensure that damaging confrontation can be avoided. So the two governments have reached the agreement of no confrontation and to be engaged on confidence-building measures and the crisis management dialogues. The 4 high-level dialogue mechanisms have been set up to ensure, as first important objective, effective communications, proper handling of disputes, and discussing feasible risk and crisis management on certain urgent issues. Besides management on security risks, another challenge, in my view, in the transition period that both countries should pay attention and handle properly is in political area. That is to be strong and smart to confront the pressures from domestic political aspect. From different reasons, in both China and the United States, nationalism and popularism are rising. And the domestic political issues and the foreign policy issues have become ever more closely related as economic interdependence and the social ties between the two countries have developed further. The successful development of China-US relations in the last half-century tells us that in every historical juncture, the top leaders, responsible politicians, and the policy-making branches in the government played extremely important roles with their strategic insights, political will, and the diplomatic wisdom to ensure this most important relationship to develop in the right direction and the long-term interests of the two nations. The same is true in the current transition of our relations. Finally, a few words about the China-US future accommodation in Asia. I think the configuration of Sino-US relationship has been changing and the balance has been shifting, which probably is irreversible. Based on that understanding, I believe the accommodation of China and the United States is the only prospect we should strike for. And that also should be based on a more stable framework. I also believe that kind of framework is also an important part of a world of multipolarization. Before that could be realized, I think there will be a pretty long transition period. And how long that will be, it depends on how the interplay between the two relations, between the two countries, and handle their differences. Of course, fundamentally speaking, I think it depends more on the development of each country herself. The ideal situation of the development process could be that in the transition period, our management technically mainly for avoiding the damaging confrontation, step by step, to develop into a positive, constructive management. Then to have more and more consensus to promote our cooperations, which will be beneficial to both countries. And that will pave the way for a stable framework of our future accommodations. And that process could be what Dr. Kissinger said, the co-evolution, because either China or United States cannot expect the other will change likewise. And each country will maintain their own course, but at the same time to accommodate with each other. And for that ideal goals, the politicians and the strategists and the diplomats should not only study the past experience in history, but also should have very much constructive vision of the future. And we should develop our relations physically, but at the same time, we should also develop our relations in kind of value levels. I believe we should find that kind of higher values. We can reach consensus to surpass our differences or disputes, which we cannot solve them right away. Before that could be realized, I believe China-US relations will be quest for a balancing point between the tensions of the power structures and the resilience of interdependent practical relations. And the past history in several decades demonstrated that pragmatism and calculation based on the rationality will always prevail on some important historical junctures and important issues. I believe this is something given by the history and the culture of two great nations. Therefore, personally, I'm cautious, optimistic in our future. Thank you very much.
Well, good evening. Can everybody hear me? And if my voice gets too far away from the mic, just sort of wave and tell me to get the volume up and I'll do it. Very glad to be here this evening. And Cui Li Ru and I was trying to think how long we've known each other, Cui, but 25 years or 30 years at least. Our gray hair is one indication of that. Anyway, thank you so much for your remarks. Thank all of you for being here. I hold Dr. Cui's remarks that he made, which are very much like an article he wrote in 2011. And that's about 6 years ago in a very rapidly changing world. I think it's a measure, really, of the deepness of his thought that he could write in 2011 something that's meaningful essentially today as well. And I want to talk a little about those ideas. In 2011, he said, China can no longer remain a bystander surveying cold-eyed the world beyond the seas. I think you said that was a quote from Mao. But it must rather act as an insider, and he called for China to play a greater role in the world in a responsible way. And like today, he talked about how power in the world was rebalancing in China's direction, I think is completely obvious, and that the United States and China needed to jointly manage what you called at that time volatility. Could be hot spots, global economic volatility, and so forth. So I want to go from what I think you framed the problem very well. I want to ask the question, how do we think about doing that? And I think the United States has some things to do, and I want to talk more about what I would think we might do to be more pragmatic, place importance on interdependence. At the same time, we have this strategic competition. I think it's probably no surprise to anybody that, of course, both I and I think most Americans would prefer to adjust to a changing balance as little as possible. We would like to see our position diminished in some sense, or at least balanced to the minimal degree. Also, I think we have a lot of interest in managing volatility. I would add the global economy to that list of things, and certainly North Korea. It seems to me, however, we have to start with a premise, and that is that at the moment, I don't think the environment is becoming more conducive, really, in either country to the management you called for 6 years ago and that I think you're calling for now. So I think we have to start from a kind of realism about what some of the problems are. We share the goal, but the environment has its problem. I think we have leaders in both our capitals, frankly, that are more assertive than the management we've had previously. You can think what you think about it, but I think it's objective reality. I think a second thing is that it's very important to Americans in their foreign policy. They kind of look at the direction of evolution, internal governance, often put as sort of human rights related, political rights related issues. And I think not all Americans agree about anything, but I think there's some consensus that China's not moving is moving in a more authoritarian direction. And I think we have to acknowledge that as a problem. I think if we look at China and how it's viewing the United States, every time I go to China, people tell me, why is the United States trying to slow us down? Containment is a repetitive word. So in some sense, I think we both see each other's internal policies going in a direction that are not very conducive to the kind of management that you're calling for. And then, as you mentioned just in passing, this environment also includes third parties going in directions that are problematic for our bilateral relationship. And that, of course, would most prominently at the moment be North Korea. But Taiwan is a problem that maybe in the discussion section will come up, but it's certainly the trends towards autonomy are deeply disturbing, I think, to China. So I would just say we have an environment that is not conducive necessarily to pragmatism and far-sighted management of volatile issues. So within that framework, though, let me suggest three things I think the United States really needs to do. And then maybe in the discussion, along with reacting to Amy's remarks as well, we can talk about how feasible or how troublesome some of these reactions might be. First of all, economically. I've been doing a research project on China's really impressive effort to build railroads in Southeast Asia. And what really struck me is the degree to which the United States' economic presence in this region is not nearly as great as it needs to be. And I think the United States ought to begin to be more supportive of the idea of connectivity, not only to China, but building out infrastructure, participating more actively in trade agreements, multilateral trade agreements that include both China and the United States. In short, I see us as sort of retreating economically where we need to create more interdependence in Asia. It can include China, but it can also include India. It can include Japan, Republic of Korea. So I think we're going, in effect, in the wrong way. We should be trying to create a balance of economic power to some extent, knowing China will always be the most weighty single actor there. But we need a balance of economic power to, I think, underpin interdependence there. And so therefore, I would see us opposing initially, and now not opposing, but not participating in the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank to have been a terrible strategic error. Withdrawing from the TPP, absolutely the wrong thing to be doing if you have this vision of interdependence being the shock absorber in our it's almost inevitable strategic competition. So I think the United States really has to reaffirm its policies really from World War II on involvement, development, importance of infrastructure, multilateral organizations, trade agreements, and so forth. I'm willing to be disabused, but I don't think we're going right in that direction at this point. And I can't with confidence say when we will. But I think that's what we should be doing. Now, the next point is that I would make, and this is probably directed both at Americans and Chinese, I think one of the many things as China has gained power is the world has opened more to China in economic and trade terms than China's opened to Americans. And I think whether you agree that that's true or not, I can guarantee you that is what Americans think, to at least a lot of Americans. And I think what the United States and China have to do is sit down and find particularly troubling areas of non-reciprocity. And I will give you a few examples just to signal what I mean. But I think China has to open up. And I don't mean just in terms of global trade balances, but let's just take the media, for example. China's got a very big media presence here with dozens, if not hundreds, of television, print, and other media here in Washington. It would be absolutely inconceivable for the United States to set an equivalent presence in China. If you look at visas for research, not equal in the terms of the duration for which visas are given. We have even people here at SAIS where we've cooperated for 31 years with the Hopkins Nanjing Center, and a great cooperation of which we're very proud, but we've got faculty members that cannot get a visa to go to China. This is a problem, maintaining support for the relationship. So if we don't, and then there's the whole issue of market access. I'll just give you an example that was kind of amazing to me last month. I was driving from Guangzhou to Hong Kong. And of course, we get to the border, and there's the PRC immigration, and then there's the Hong Kong, and there's like a no man's land of 100 yards. And when you get 50 yards into the no man's land, suddenly all of your electronic equipment begins to work properly again, by which I mean you get access to all the things you didn't have access to. And China's got information openness on the part of the United States, but we don't find that reciprocal. So what I'm really saying is I'm not pushing on any particular issue, but what I'm saying is we have to sit down and find areas of inequity where we can level the playing field where it's possible. Some areas aren't going to be possible, and it's going to be a problem. We'll have to be pragmatic. But particularly in the trade area and access for American companies in what China considers pillar industries, we are very concerned by what we see as an industrial policy and selective barriers against areas we're most worried about. And if we're going to improve the relationship and manage volatility and do all these things, there has to be restored a basic sense of fairness in the relationship. And of course, who thinks what is fair is complicated to be arrived at by negotiation. Nobody will get everything they want. I understand all of that, but we've got to make some progress. Americans are pretty patient when they see progress, and they're not very patient when they see it going the wrong way. So somehow we've got to establish, I think, a little more equal playing field. Now, finally, on North Korea, because you raised that, and I did want to talk about it, and certainly I don't speak for anybody other than myself. This is not any trial balloon, but I'll tell you what I've kind of concluded, and I would be very interested at what Chinese reaction might be. And that is after, 25 years almost watching the United States, China, North Korea, and others interact on the weapons program, one in North Korea, it seems very clear to me that all of the various six-party talks, conferences, threats, patience, policy of patience, all of this has not deflected the North Korean program very much at all. We've just seen steady progress on both warheads and delivery vehicles, missiles and so forth. So everything we've done to this point hasn't made much, if any, difference. That's the first point. Secondly, after all these years, I've sort of concluded that I think, and it started with a conversation I had with Jiang Zemin in 2002. He almost said this, but I won't attribute it to him. But the conclusion I've come to, really recently, is that China would rather live with a nuclear Korea than achieve a non-nuclear Korea peninsula through instability or violence. And therefore, China's bottom line is that it is willing to live with a nuclear North Korean, because I believe anything short of a forceful, possibly destabilizing action will not get them to give them up. And so I think in a way China's decided to live with nuclear weapons there. And that may be the right decision. So then the question is, okay, wouldn't a policy of deterrence work? That is, just as we had with China and the Soviet Union in an earlier era. One thing that seems clear is the Kim regime wants to survive. This whole thing has been about its survival. So maybe we have to agree to live with it. Maybe if we can negotiate some limits and arms control to keep it from spiraling ever more up, that would be good. Maybe we ought to have a peace treaty. Maybe we ought to gradually improve trade. But I guess what I think is we're on a dead end where we're going. And the primary problem is that politicians don't want to say their policies failed. And that's true both in China and the US. So maybe we're just going to have to live with something we don't like we did with India and Pakistan. It's not my preferred outcome, but I'd like to know how we're going to move in a positive direction unless somebody thinks the North Koreans actually will get rid of their weapons. And they've put too much into this and come too far to do it. So, long and the short of it is I very much agree we ought to try to build interdependence. We need to do that by, I think, creating a more feeling of equitable relationship. We need to somehow get some progress on this North Korean issue. And Americans need to get their finance, trade policies, not to mention our domestic policy, under control. So you will hear, I hope you heard here, was a recognition that America needs to do a lot of things here. But we need some cooperation from China. Thank you very much.
It's really great to be back at SAIS, and I'm honored to be with my fellow panelists and former professor here talking about China. And in fact, I'm going to pick up and talk a little bit more about, of course, the economic relationship with China and very much dig deeper into what Professor Lampton was just saying about fairness in U.S.-China trade relations and specifically market access issues. Our economic relationship with China, as Professor Cui mentioned, has of course never been so important to both of our countries, and our economies have in fact never been so intertwined with so much more opportunity for expansion. It took real political leadership in Beijing and Washington 20 years ago, along with a hugely supportive American business community, to set this economic relationship on the incredible growth trajectory through negotiation of China's accession to the World Trade Organization in 2001. However, despite this deepened integration and a trading relationship valued at around $600 billion a year, I'm afraid that I can't be very optimistic right now, as I'd like to be, about the bilateral trade and investment climate between our two countries. Maybe it's because this past weekend I spent time reading the 56 sets of testimonies submitted by Chinese and American stakeholders to the U.S. government as part of the Trump administration's Section 301 investigation into, and I quote, China's acts, policies, and practices related to technology transfer, intellectual property, and innovation. Tomorrow, of course, there'll be a public hearing on these issues at the ITC. But even before this weekend's long set of readings and before the U.S. launched its Section 301 investigation into Chinese policies that may be harming U.S. industry in August, we all had seen challenges becoming more and more contentious on the trade and investment front. casting a pall, in fact, over the larger relationship rather than acting as the ballast that commercial ties had provided for decades in U.S.-China relations. While the scale and the scope of our economic ties have, of course, expanded, so has the imbalance in the relationship. And our two countries have also increasingly been at odds over what rules should govern access to our respective economies. In the aftermath of the global financial crisis, protectionist policies in both countries and around the world have increasingly challenged accepted principles and rules over international trade. The U.S. and China have more to gain from enhancing our economic relationship and continuing to act in concert to deal with global economic growth. But this will require commitments, accommodations from both our countries to find common ground on contentious trade and investment issues, including how national security considerations should impact market access in both our countries. Like 20 years ago, political leaders in both countries will face tough calls to take our economic relations to a renewed level of mutual benefit. We have the opportunity next month when our two presidents meet in Beijing. But I think the only way to make progress is for both sides to make accommodations in how we govern the bilateral trade relationship going forward. China must continue to make concrete policy changes that enhance rather than restrict market access for American goods and services. And the U.S. must recognize the validity of international trade rules to govern how our bilateral relationship is governed. I'm not sure the present environment is going to allow for this kind of accommodation in either of our capitals next month. But I'm sure that cooperation in this trade area would help our two countries face the many challenges we confront across the spectrum of U.S.-China ties. So my perspective on these economic issues is absolutely shaped by my current work at Albright Stonebridge Group, helping foreign investors navigate the rapidly changing China market. For all of my corporate clients, American, European, and Asian, the development of U.S.-China relations is of significant interest. Our bespoke advice at Albright Stonebridge Group to each client involves strategic counsel on ways that a company can find commonality between its corporate goals in China and China's own economic development goals as set by the Chinese government. This goal alignment is meant to help our foreign clients demonstrate their interest in and value to the China market for the long term. The rather precarious state of U.S.-China economic relations in 2017 is complicating this work, and an increasing number of my corporate clients are concerned that their business could be directly and adversely affected by a downturn in commercial relations, or heaven forbid, the start of a trade war. When I step back from my individual client issues and look at trade and investment opportunities and challenges for the U.S. and China, of course it's possible to be reassured by statistics, given the massive size and breadth of our commercial relationship. China buys 1 in 4 of the soybeans grown in the United States. China is responsible for 33% of global demand for finished U.S. semiconductors. Inbound Chinese investment, of course, in the United States surpassed American investment in China for the first time in 2015. But then I step back further still, and I look at the global environment for trade and investment, where we see the rise in protectionism that has led to an impulse to throw out rules built to grow global economic cooperation and instead protect local economies. We've seen this in the United States, in Europe, and in China. In the US, this decidedly more protectionist sentiment in the Trump administration reflects a growing perception that Americans have been hurt by globalization and that trade deals negotiated in the past are unfair. During last year's American presidential campaign and since his election, President Trump has focused on renegotiating trade agreements and reducing deficits. With China, the Trump administration, of course, has been mainly pushing on two fronts: to remove market access restrictions harming U.S. exporters and investors in China, and to enhance protections against unfair trade coming from China into the U.S. market. As we all heard, the trade imbalance was one of two priority issues that President Trump and President Xi discussed when they met in Florida. And it seems trade again, and North Korea, will be a focus of President Trump's trip to Beijing next month. Following the Mar-a-Lago summit and the disappointing first comprehensive economic dialogue meeting here in Washington this summer, Trump administration officials have reiterated that if the U.S. can't achieve balanced trade by convincing China to reciprocate higher levels of market access, then more defensive means will be employed. Concerned over global capacity, the administration has already begun investigations into whether imports of aluminum or steel are detrimental to U.S. national security. And in August, of course, the U.S. launched this investigation under Section 301 of the 1974 Trade Act to examine whether China's IP protections and technology transfer requirements constitute unfair trade practices that burden U.S. commerce. All of these investigations could result in an imposition of unilateral sanctions against imports to the United States. And there are rumblings these actions could, of course, start a trade war. Distinct from years past, the American business community is unlikely to fight for a positive economic relationship unless it sees the prospect for real progress on some of the market access challenges it faces in China. That's a big shift for the U.S. business community, once the uniform cheering section for U.S.-China ties. But from an American business perspective, progress has slowed in China in recent years on key economic initiatives launched by China's accession to the WTO. While trade flows with China, of course, continue to grow, the ability of American companies to compete in China is increasingly limited. Despite working on it for 8 years, a bilateral investment treaty between the U.S. and China has been repeatedly stalled by Chinese and American roadblocks, and its future is uncertain due to misgivings by the Trump administration. Enhancing openness to both of our markets was one point made by the U.S. and China at the Mar-a-Lago summit. But there are sticking points on both sides, as both of our countries seek to enhance protections of domestic markets and promote trade and investment ties between our two countries. The U.S. government wants American companies to enjoy the same level of market access in China as Chinese enjoy in the United States. And the Chinese government wants more assurance that the U.S. market remains open for Chinese investments. In the U.S., there's broad bipartisan support to enact tougher policies with China, including potentially instituting the principle of reciprocity to govern trade and investment. When he was in Beijing late last month, Commerce Secretary Ross talked about rebalancing the lopsided relationship with China. And the Section 301 investigation that's been launched will certainly be part of that process. Reading through the 301 testimony submissions, all 56 of them, I was struck by a few things. Of course, most Chinese submissions downplayed the existence of policies harming American investors in China, while almost all of the U.S. submissions stressed challenges that have existed for years. But on a more hopeful note, almost all of the 301 submissions also had two common themes. One was a recognition of the progress China has made in improving the environment for IP over the past 20 years, and the positive impact deep in U.S.-China relations have had on our two countries and, of course, on the world. And then second, almost all of the submissions included a plea that unilateral action by the U.S. government, inconsistent with WTO rules, would harm the overall relationship much more than it would help it. It is not the way to deal with the thorny issues existing in bilateral trade today. We need these common themes and goals among academics and industry, particularly as our governments are increasingly willing to diverge on shared goals in the international arena. In 2016, Presidents Xi and Obama noted that climate change had become a pillar of the US-China bilateral relationship. And yesterday, our EPA administrator here in Washington announced he would begin repealing the Obama administration's climate change rule for power plants, undermining a key part of the US commitment to the Paris Agreement. When the Trump administration already announced that it would pull out of the Paris Agreement, China said, "We'll go it alone. We don't need you." As US-China trade continues to face unprecedented challenges, we need positive areas of cooperation and positive breakthroughs to help us withstand these disagreements. North Korea cooperation simply is not enough. This meeting in November between our two presidents is an opportunity to make commitments and accommodations to one another. I hope the US government will commit to adherence to WTO rules to govern the existing 301 investigation, underscoring that the US wants to overcome bilateral trade imbalance through enhanced trade, not through increased protections of the domestic market. I hope the US government will relaunch high-standard bilateral investment treaty negotiations and push for enhanced openness of the Chinese economy and reassure the Chinese that the US economy, the most open economy in the world, will remain open to Chinese participants. I also hope that China will take practical, pragmatic, and concrete steps to reduce bottlenecks and barriers to its market for US goods and services. Just yesterday, China's State Council announced a measure that will speed up approval for foreign drugs and medical devices by allowing overseas clinical trial data in China's drug registration application. That's something foreign industry, including some of my clients, have been asking for years. It will eliminate a multi-year delay in getting world-class drugs and medical technology to Chinese patients. Now that's what we call a win-win. More measures like this to remove hurdles to the market are needed, not only for US exporters, but also for the Chinese economy. Rising above the fray, both the US and China have profound long-term interest in committing to an expanded, mutually beneficial bilateral trade and investment ties. But to achieve such an outcome, both sides will need to resist a continued focus on protectionism in words and in action. Thank you.
So we're all going to.
I'm going to grab my notes.
Oh, okay.
I'll sit here. Well, first of all, thanks very much to all three speakers for very appropriate, substantive, challenging remarks. Before we go further, I should give each one of you, first thanks, but also to see if you would like to make any comments, having heard the other two, before we go on. Why don't we start, Professor Cui? You don't have to, but if there are some things that you'd like to remark on before we go to the questions.
Having this thing, two comments from. I haven't heard this fairness argument, especially about economic. I think it's fair to raise fairness. But in my opinion, is sometimes we just emphasize on one side and at the same time put aside or ignore the other side. That is the challenge of our relation, mainly because China's capacity is because of these large capacity, big guy China. A lot of things depends what you emphasize is. And if you try to observe fairly, objectively about China's level of development, which is a developing country. And China has developed in a very short period. So this means when the United States believes China becomes more competitive than and challenged by these more competitive, and you have raised your demandings. And if we compare China's development process with all the other nations, we spend less time open our market. I'm not specialized. I'm pretty sure about that. Mainly because China is too large. So you have different standards on China. And for the individual enterprises, businessmen, I think it's very much understand. But from the government policy, you have to complicate it. And another point is China takes time to develop its domestic system, govern all these challenges from the foreign competitors, business. And in a short period, and with such dramatic development, our legal things and also about the expertise of the people are very much, I think, still very weak and the lack of experience. Another word is great vulnerabilities of China's economy. So the government policy sometimes stand on that kind of understanding about the complexities of China. Another point is, of course, there are different interests and groups, including the bureaucracies. They will defend what they would like to defend. So sometimes the outside pressures, in a certain sense, will help China to make progress. We see entering of WCO is the case. So this is what I use this opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask Amy to elaborate on a point if I understood, I agreed with, but to clarify, and that you said in passing, talking about trade equality and more fairness in the relationship, North Korea is not enough, was your phraseology. And just, I assume you were talking about President Trump earlier on saying if we get more cooperation on North Korea, we could ease up a little. The implication was on trade, and I think he even said Taiwan. So what did you mean by that? And I think that's a very important point. You're saying as strategically important as Korea is to us, it isn't going to compensate the business community is what I thought you meant.
That's exactly what I meant, actually. Just thinking about what we really have been prioritizing this year, in 2017, in U.S.-China relations. The president was explicit in linking those issues. And so for the administration, certainly, I think the president has made that one statement. But I don't think, one, the business community agrees with that. And two, I don't think we can really rely on that on a healthy way to think about U.S.-China relations. I have to admit, I hearken back to the Obama administration where the U.S. and China were focused on so many ways where our two countries are cooperating on global issues of import. And that was a foundation for the relationship, an incredibly important pillar as trade ties were becoming more contentious. And what I fear going forward is without those commonalities of global economic interest. And instead, we see diverging views over whether and how the United States and China should cooperate on global issues. We're just not going to be able to rely on that much. North Korea is certainly not enough.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, I'll just say, Professor Cui, I thought it was very helpful the way that you put together that framework about U.S.-China relations. I have to say, in Washington, it always does strike me when I hear yourself and other China scholars talk about a new era in the world, and that era being the end of American predominance. And what does that mean for an American ability to deal with China? I very much agree that it's difficult for the United States to think about that, but what it does require is keen management and the phrase that you used, accommodation. I think Professor Lampton said this at the beginning of his remarks. The environment in Beijing and in Washington doesn't seem terrifically conducive to accommodation right now. And I think that's probably going to be one of the areas where we struggle in the near future.
Thanks very much. Now I'm going to take advantage of my role as moderator to add just a comment or two. Of course, these are three great experts on the specifics of this topic, much greater than myself. On the other hand, I like to think about this in terms of what is the structure for this engagement and cooperation, and thinking about it in terms, as was described, global, regional, and bilateral. And it seems to me, if we start at the bilateral, there is a structure, the strategic engagement, certainly on economics, that already exists. In other words, we don't have to create a format or a venue for engagement. The substance is another matter. The progress and cooperation is another matter, but the venue exists. Then let me jump to the global level. Do we have structures in place that are adequate to deal with global issues and global engagement? And here, of course, we start with the post-war trinity of the United Nations as the venue for dealing with political and security issues, with the International Monetary Fund to deal with financial issues, and originally the GATT, now the WTO, to deal with trade issues. The three great challenges that whose failure to engage led to the Depression and World War II. Where do we stand in terms of these global engagement? And I would say things are not looking as great as they might. We could start with the UN, and where we can see the UN, for whatever reason, it was agreed that would be the venue for dealing, among other things, with climate change issues. The United States has just announced its intention to pull out of the climate change or pull back from the COP22 agreement in Paris, undermining the clarity of the commitment to this global venue. The WTO, here we can see in the wake of the global financial crisis, the principal institutional response was the creation of the G20 at the leaders level, which exists, but I doubt that all of you would think it's been a huge success in producing substantive engagement and progress. And certainly, there is a sense in the four areas that the G20 set its goals. Number one, to restore global growth, which has not happened to the degree we're not back to pre-crisis pace of growth. To repair and reform the global financial system. I don't think anyone thinks that that is a job that has been, where the mission has been accomplished. Two, the initial agreement was to complete the Doha development round in the WTO, prevent new protectionism, and promote new lines of trade liberalization. I don't think anyone thinks that has happened. And finally, to reform the international financial institutions. And what instead has happened is a new one has been formed that is a partial, not a global institution, that seems to be uncertain in terms of its relationship to the pre-existing multilateral development banks. And by this I mean the largest infrastructure project at a global level today is One Belt, One Road. But this was created and is being financed completely outside the pre-existing network of multilateral development banks, calling into question the relevance of the pre-existing order. And in the IMF, even though, although it's not widely recognized, inherent in the IMF's Articles of Agreement, which is its constitution, a mandate for periodic reevaluations of voting shares based on economic weight that were intended inherently to rebalance voting power as a matter of course. There, I think, is a general sense that it hasn't been as complete as it should be. So, a problem at the global level, the institutions exist, but uncertain what the commitment is. And then final point, it strikes me, however, at the regional level, we don't have institutions. That you could say the fastest growing region for the last, 25 years, 30 years, the fastest growing region economically has been Asia. When we look forward, I think most people think that's going to be true for the next 30 years. There's been a huge change in both economic, financial, and political power, and yet there are no pan-Asian regional institutions that seem adequate to deal with political security issues, financial issues, or trade issues. And there, it seems to me, there's much to do. So that's my point. Thank you for indulging me. And now it's time for all of you. We have some time set aside, plenty of time for questions. So please feel free. I'll recognize you. Though please wait for the microphone, and as a matter of courtesy to our guests, our speakers, please identify yourself and your affiliation before you ask your questions. So let's start with this gentleman right here.
I'm Roger. Is that loud? Okay. Roger Cliff of the Center for Naval Analyses. I actually was, in a vague way, kind of reassured by these presentations, although I don't think that was the intention, because everyone started out by talking about the fundamental problem of the U.S. and China getting along in the world, but then fairly quickly we devolved into some fairly specific and technocratic kind of issues. Whereas I mainly worry about a war. And so my question is, could any or all the speakers speculate a little bit about what potential triggers for military conflict might be, and in particular, whether or not there's a pathway that leads from these seemingly innocuous technocratic issues to the type of competition and friction that could actually result in military conflict?
Challenging question, good. Who wants to start?
Thank you for the questions. My personal view is that I don't think there is immediate dangers for a war between our two nations. And the possible sparkling point is in the Korean Peninsula. And of course, we have a long time issues of Taiwan, and that is a potential problem for us. But I think in last decades, we have reached a very agreement that is to maintain the status quo. And even the Bush administration's United States took a very strong position and let Taiwan leaders understand that is very much important. And since then, I think the situation cross-strait is very stable. I think that will continue. And the danger in Korean Peninsula is because now I agree with Michael's point about this. If we cannot think out something more effective, and actually we are facing a dead end of these issues. But I think the danger is that this vicious circle and escalation of the rhetoric, and the leaders in DPRK are determined to develop their nuclear weapons. And I don't think there is an outside force can enforce them to stop, and unless you take military actions. And the military action is not feasible at all. And I think the leaders, the people in the South Korea will not agree. And if the United States want to take that actions only based on that kind of threat, that threat is directing at United States, then the United States can surpass their legitimate right from the South Korea's green light, then you just launch your military. I don't think that situation will come. So, but the misjudgment and this kind of escalation sometimes could trigger off something unexpectedly. So this is the only danger. That's why I think the academic circles, both in China and United States, agreed we should have some pre-discussions, informal discussions about that kind of situation and what we can do for the preparations. Thank you.
I guess the way I'd approach it is that there's a low probability of war, and I'll get into briefly a couple of things where there is some probability but low. But were there war, it'd be very high impact, right? So you devote a lot of attention to a low probability event because it'd be so bad if it happened. It's justified trying to prevent a low probability event. Now, the ones I worry about, just in the category of I could at least see, you asked trigger and pathway kind of question. Certainly I can see the long-term trend of what we might just call more autonomy-minded Taiwan, and that covers a lot of real estate, and an increasingly vigorous, muscular China, and some development internally that triggers China's need to act in its own political milieu. And I think that whatever that risk is, probably over time, it seems to me, getting bigger, but maybe from a low level. So I agree, if you look at the current government in Taiwan, it seems to me it's trying to reduce friction points, broadly speaking. But it seems to me China's turning up the pressure on them economically and otherwise. So I do worry about it. I think it's a low probability event, but it certainly would be an absolute fiasco for regional stability and U.S.-China relations were it to happen. So I think we need to carefully manage that. And so when a president sort of cavalierly says maybe we can trade off the one China policy, I mean, I don't know what universe he's operating in, right? So I think we need to be responsible in our rhetoric and our behavior, not to exacerbate it. So that's the Taiwan thing. Korea, I could see, and because you have, you have a number of things that could lead to a scramble in North Korea that would be rather perhaps uncontrollable, particularly if we don't China and the United States talk to each other about how we would manage a collapse or some other really unstable event there, because we have to get control one way or another. Somebody of all those, whatever the number is, nuclear devices and so forth, order would need to be reestablished, and indeed, the ROK would be very motivated to stop refugee flow its way and China its way. So you're going to have a lot of actors there in relatively confined space with a lot of weaponry. And I could see a lot, maybe not a war, but some clashes that would be very unfortunate before we got control over whoever the we is. So I am worried about what a collapse in North Korea would produce in terms of bringing American troops into proximity potentially with Chinese troops in a very volatile situation. But there are lots of reasons we should still, even if it doesn't lead to war, be concerned about all these things. First of all, they can lead to incidents like the EP3 incident, and the inadvertent sort of collision of forces and so on, and that can have unfortunate consequences. So I think we need to really try to manage this at the lowest possible level of friction. War's a low probability, but not a no probability. And between two nuclear powers, I would say low probability is unacceptable. Is that, Roger, enough of an approach?
Can I just, let me follow up
Oh,
with Mike. If, you mentioned that the idea that inevitably we're going to have to get used to the idea that North Korea is going to be nuclear armed and we have to think about arms control and things like that. What do you consider it likely that one of the responses to an acceptance of a nuclear North Korea in the long term will be a nuclear armed Japan and potentially other Asian countries?
of course, there are people that know more about Japan than I'll ever know, but I would say you have to be willing, probably with the proposal I advance, there's going to be proliferations among some bodies in Asia, because the Japanese are going to be very worried, and it depends in part how credible U.S. nuclear umbrella is, so we have something to do with that, and we should try to be more credible rather than less. But the Japanese are going to be very worried about it. The Republic of Korea, we've already stopped an effort in this direction at least once. Taiwan, we've stopped once or twice. So there is a kind of underneath it thought in these societies. And certainly if the Japanese got it, you can be pretty sure the South Koreans would be thinking about it again. So I don't know exactly how it would unfold, but with the proposal I advanced, I think you would have to say undesirable to have this kind of proliferation, but so is a war on the Korean Peninsula.
Yeah. I should say that this is the thought behind, underneath all that is, again, the lack of regional organizations to deal with this, the uncertainty of how they will evolve and what the U.S. role will be in the long run with regard to those organizations.
I wanted to say, because I thought your point was really good on the regional business, and that is, yes, there is a dearth of institutions, particularly on the security side, but you can say there are some institutions, and they are the 5 U.S. alliances that originally were aimed at China and now don't include China. So there's a structure that explicitly excludes China. That's first thing. And the trade structures are, and we've both been acting to create trade arrangements that keep the other out. So we're working with the China-U.S. Education Exchange Fund to build a Pacific community, some structures that in the economic and security area have both China and the United States. I mean, it's madness to try to have regional governance in which the 2 major powers in the region are either by force of history or current policy trying to exclude each other. It's madness.
But I think, unfortunately, the U.S. had been working under TPP to think one day it would include China, and it seemed like 2.5 years ago the Chinese government was coming around to the concept that one day China would be a member of TPP. And so, yeah, in your remarks, Mike, I think talking about the disintegration of the American presence in the region in ways that actually helps the region itself is really unfortunate with TPP. And now, sitting in Washington, D.C., we're waiting to see if the current administration is going to pull back even further from the way that it is integrated economically and adhering to WTO and then in its other regional free trade agreements to things like binding dispute settlement. And so that doesn't look good for the U.S. in filling this very much needed role in bringing us together, including with China, where President Xi at Davos last January said, hey, we're here, China is ready to pick up this mantle of globalization, which again is very welcomed, but we want to see what the actions in that regard really mean.
Exactly right. Or you could say TPP was a good idea only in the context that it was it was a way station to something else.
Right.
But it itself was hardly, it was not an end in itself. It was a way someplace. Yes. Right.
Thank you. Dong Huiyu with China Review News Agency of Hong Kong. And President Trump will visit Beijing in November. And I think Amy has touched upon the issue and your expectation in the economic area. But I'm wondering, what can we expect in the security area, like on North Korea issue or Taiwan issue or military issue? What can we expect from that visit? Thank you.
My opinion is in security area, the key word is management. Manage all disputes on some important issues. And there won't be a fundamental breakthrough on these disagreements. But we do have some areas that we can cooperate with each other. And I think the full dialogue mechanism and high-level mechanism, I think will play some role on that. And my observation is that the Trump administration didn't have a prepared strategy when they came to the office. They have some very rough ideas and some campaign rhetorics. And then now the administrative policy is a kind of mixture of the campaign rhetorics with the established policies there. So the established policy in Asia of the United States is roughly the rebalance strategy and raised by Obama administration. I think that will continue. I think the established influence is still very strong there. But the approaches of Trump administration is somewhat different because of the new president. So the interplay between the two countries will find a balance between these two differences. The continuity in China's side is still very much stable. That's it.
I'm trying to envision this meeting between the two presidents here. I guess the operative phrase with which, if I understood correctly, Li Ru, was no breakthroughs. Did I hear you correctly? Yeah, no breakthroughs. I would say that. I don't think first of all, if you're going to have be successful in negotiating with anybody, and I would say the Chinese in this case, it has to be clear what you want. And if you just look at the internal division on trade policy and security policy, and the president not long ago countermanded a draft agreement that his own commerce secretary came up with. So if I was the Chinese, I'd say, what can we give you that we can give you that would satisfy you, that you would even internally agree about? I'm hard to see what this would be. Now, I think the Chinese will probably find a few things like maybe electric cars or some more market access in some containable areas. I think there'll be something like that. On the security side, I'm sure we'll try to look like we're cooperating on North Korea. But the point is, I don't think whatever we do on North Korea is going to produce them conceding to the eventual purpose of denuclearization and seriously proceed in that direction. So I think your operative phrase is no breakthrough, as much maybe a little cosmetic economic concessions going in the right direction, which I'm all in favor of.
Technical coordination.
Right, but, you know, I think Americans very rapidly get jaded because when we met at the Mar-a-Lago summit, we promised a 100-day negotiating period, then we met in July, and all we got is a promise, well, we got a delivery on a promise that had been made one or more previous times on beef. Amy's signaling 5, I lost track. So we're getting a little bit jaded on communiques from bilateral dialogues that don't get implemented. But any case, it's better that we talk than not talk.
And I might just say, I think I mentioned hopes for both sides and not probably all of it being achievable progress and deliverables. I completely agree with no breakthroughs, although I think in Washington, I've been watching the Commerce Department try to pull together the CEO trade mission to China and very much focus on deliverables, on specifics, but these are very specific and individual things rather than market access writ large.
In the back first, all the way back, and then we'll in front.
I'm Stanley Kober. Every March, PricewaterhouseCoopers publishes a report on the 100 largest companies in the world by market capitalization, listing them. This year, 55 of the 100 largest were American companies. This is up from 42 in 2009. China has remained static at 11. If China is overtaking the United States, how do you explain these numbers?
First, a very buoyant U.S. stock market, but
When I talk about China's GDP surpass U.S. GDP, that does not mean China will take over Americans' positions. They are two different concepts. I think in the United States, it will maintain superiority in many areas for a very long time. So I think China is how to say, calm-minded in realizing that kind of fact. And, but China's confidence is that we will keep moving and be confident we will finally reach our goal there. The goal is not to beat the United States. The goal is not to be the #1. Of course, there are a very strong or sort of strong nationalism rhetorics in China too. And, but I think that the government policy is to realize Chinese national modernization, and that could be beneficial for both of us. Thank you.
okay.
Stanley, I just wanted to ask a question. If I understand, maybe John, you know, but if we start looking at banks and world capitalization of banks around the world, aren't like a huge number out of the top 10 Chinese?
Yeah, if you look at
So I think there are
size of their
different
balance
dimensions, at least here, of corporate power. And also, I think if you ask, though, why the U.S., with relatively small population, still totally disproportionate share of big countries, I would say that we're at least structured for innovation and entrepreneurship, and China has I would say, a very heavily pillar industry, industrial policy sort of orientation. So I think we've got a lot of things that help account for that. But China's got a lot of capital, training a lot of human talent, and I think that people that see an erosion are looking at when those other things kick in. But I think you're right. Right now, the United States is still, given that we're 4% of the world's people, we're surely contributing a whole lot more than 4% of the innovation, big companies, technological advance, and so forth. So I think we have to keep kind of two ideas in mind: momentum and time and current situation.
And in a way, you can summarize China's economic challenge in a nutshell. China invests almost double the percentage of GDP of any other country, and yet today their growth in productivity is only average for emerging markets. So the challenge is they're investing not very efficiently right now, and that needs to improve. But that's not something the Chinese authorities haven't noticed. That's exactly why they say reform is necessary. But there was another question. Yes? Hello, and then we'll come over here.
Hi, my name is Kelso Horn, and I'm a student of economics at West Texas A&M University. So in 2011, Chinese academics stated that within the next couple of years, they wanted 3 aircraft carriers for their fleet. And since then, we've seen them purchase 1 aircraft carrier from Ukraine. In 2017, in April, we saw them build their own aircraft carrier from the ground up. And the report is the new aircraft carrier they're building will be the first Chinese aircraft carrier to use a catapult rather than a ski jump system. Given their strategic concerns in the South China Sea, as well as their continued economic growth, do you see them continuing to invest more money in their sea power, and do you see them at some point in the near future matching or even overcoming our current naval position in the Pacific region?
I think there is an irony there, or maybe I can call it a paradox there. And China realized this realistic world in a larger sense from its experience dealing with outside world since the 100 years ago. Then China has been learning the theories and the thoughts and the concepts of international politics. And my understanding is most Chinese students and professors who have been studying Western theories of international politics, and they tend to, or consciously or unconsciously, understand this world based on the realism. So that will inevitably become some of the understanding of China's policy and on this world, and understanding and its policy making. So when we see China's what the statements of the government about this world, and then also I think that is a sincere belief and idea. But when we see China's policy and the practical conducts, which is a gap from this what you may call the rhetorics or statements. And actually, China has been doing it just between the two. And this is a realistic world based on the realism. And as Dr. Described of the post-world order established based on the American predominance of this. So China has to face this fact. But at the same time, the ideal vision is that we can find, as I pointed out, a kind of accommodation which can get rid of these realism power struggles. And, but as a practical policy, you cannot just pull yourself and get rid from this earth. It's not impossible. So based on that understanding, China's defense capability will further develop. And as you said, these aircraft carriers, if they want to develop these things, no, 1 is not enough. 2 will not be enough. So my understanding is we do not have to develop it. But now we are developing these kind of things, at least 3 is necessary. That's my understanding.
20 years ago right now, I was at SAIS studying China's military modernization, and it's amazing to me thinking 20 years ago about that goal. But I think at that time we were talking about a blue water navy and how China would develop one. I completely agree with you, Professor Cui. Of course, 3 sounds right and probably won't be enough as we think about China in 2017.
Got a couple of points. One is that, of course, as China's modernization and it becomes a more urbanized society and along the coast, and GDP is more concentrated along the coast, China quite naturally wants to push conflict as far away from its territory as possible, and that means have it in the distant seas and have it in distant airspace. So I think what China's doing is perfectly predictable. Let's just put it that way. The trouble is, of course, the U.S. has dominated air and sea, so if you're to push back, that's going to create friction with the previously dominant power. So the fact that we're worried about it is also perfectly predictable. But what I was going to say is when you start ratcheting up the numbers of aircraft carriers, which I think they will, when you talk about an aircraft carrier, you're talking about at least 14 or 15 support ships. And probably the biggest investment is protecting the carrier as opposed to the carrier when you get all done. So you're talking about a massive financial commitment. And of course, you've indicated here, which is, I think, true, China's got lots of internal development needs. So China's going to face a guns and butter food versus and security, internal security versus external security problem. And also, I would just consider one other thing. You know, the United States has a luxury of only having, you know, in fact, Canada on one side and Mexico on the other side, and a fairly Pacific regional environment. China's got 14 neighbors, all of whom are much smaller than China. And as China acquires this capability, you're going to set off reactions in all those smaller, insecure states. Some of them, like Singapore, will buy their own means of defense. Others will seek protection from a big power, Japan or the United States. And so, you know, I think you have to sort of ask, where does this begin and what are China's real security interests?
Yeah, let's. No, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Jacob Lee from Johns Hopkins University SAIS. Well, I have a questions for, well, before I begin my questions, I came from South Korea, so it is quite a relevant issue for me. So it is a matter of like, North Korea issue is a matter of like a power game between China and United States. For Korea, and it's a matter of survivor, I believe. So recently, South Korea governments decide to bring like missile defense system called the SARD, Terminal Altitude Area Defense Systems from United States, and it created tension between South Korea and China. So obviously, China is not happy about it and giving really economic pressure on South Korea's sides. So my question is for United States. Is the United States going to intervene in these issues if the United States see it problematic? Yeah.
Well, I guess that was the... Well, I couldn't hear clearly, but you were asking about THAAD and the Terminal High Altitude Anti-Ballistic Missile System that the United States has been providing South Korea against the North Korean missile threat. And so, of course, the U.S. sees that as a perfectly defensive and defensible transfer of technology to an ally to protect you from a nearby threat for which this might be at least somewhat effective. So there's not much debate, I think, in the U.S. about whether this is appropriate. There's been some debate in South Korea about that. But the point of the present discussion is China is now, I will say in air quotes, punishing South Korea for agreeing to provide the place for these to be based on the peninsula. So South Korean department stores, I think that, I don't know the company, Ely, Lotte, yeah, that's right, yeah, is suffering by virtue of Chinese retaliation, I will say. And of course, China has at least declarative reasons. They're worried about it's not simply aimed potentially at North Korea, it's aimed, in their view, radars into China itself and affects their deterrence. So China has an argument, but the point is South Korea has a demonstrable need in the current environment, and China has decided to inflict punishment for an understandable decision. So I think this is an example of China not managing its neighbors very well. You know, I'm sure that an arrangement could be worked out. If the threat goes away, then maybe we don't need the defensive means, right? But China's not being very reassuring to its neighbors when it punishes them for protecting themselves against what seemed to everybody else to be a demonstrable threat. Even if you concede the radar business, which I guess isn't fully conceded.
As an American sitting here in Washington, D.C., I have to say, I think South Korean residents also probably are questioning the U.S. commitment to South Korea on THAAD, maybe because the U.S. is also calling into question KORUS right now, our free trade agreement, and talking about reopening that. And so while I agree with Professor Lanton that the United States has made a decision to provide this defense, and it's unfortunate that China is punishing South Korea for it, I think South Korean citizens probably are worried about the extent of the U.S. commitment to South Korea right now and our free trade agreement.
This is not a question for me, but I think China is being involved because of these sad issues. And the complexity of that is it has several aspects of these issues. And technically speaking, THAAD is not that kind of directly useful to defend South Korea. But I think for its positive part as a measure is that the United States and South Korea has to do something when it is provoked by the DPRK there. And that is one of the reasons. But another reason is I think United States wants to build up this defensive system. I think that is important for the United States for the long-term interests and the securities. And in that aspect, and something has been understood as something threatening the strategic balance between China and the United States in Northeast Asia area. And so that's the problem. But the Lotte things is because the Earth, the system deployed belongs to the Lotte. So the Lotte sells the Earth to
The land.
to the U.S. Army, and but the Lotte has made a lot of money in China's market. So that is one of the reasons China punished the Lottes.
No.
Oh, okay. Okay, right here.
Hi, my name is Koji Flindo. I'm a first-year undergraduate at the Elliott School of International Affairs, and my question is regarding Xi Jinping's consolidation of power. So Chinese presidents since Mao have typically taken 2 5-year terms, and during their second term have begun to groom a successor. And 5 years into Xi Jinping's term, we haven't seen any successor who is clearly going to take his place once he goes. So in light of the upcoming 19th National Congress of the Communist Party, I have 2 questions. So the first is, why do you believe that this is the case, that he hasn't selected a successor? And what does this indicate about his reform efforts in the future of China? And the second question is, how does Xi's consolidation of power affect U.S. foreign policy and outlook towards China, particularly in the realm of cooperation and investment? Thank you.
That sounds like a question.
Right, I was going to say, I have a view, but I think we'll ask the expert.
I don't think no one can answer about the successors questions. And, but I don't know, to be frank with you. But there isn't a legal limitation for how long are Chinese leaders to stay in power. But what is that? It is a tradition is that 2 terms. And since Jiang Zemin, I said. And so, but my understanding is this is something very much concerned, not concerned, and very much interested by the outside world about Xi Jinping, if he will stay longer than 2 terms. But from China's point of view, I think if he decides to stay longer, it is very much understandable and probably will be supported by the majority of China population. But if he has some successors after 2 terms, he stepped down, I think that all will be fine. So I think that is not very much a controversial issue in China. This is my comment.
I don't know how controversial it is from my observation. I certainly hear a lot of people talking about it in China. So I think the interest level suggests people are paying attention to that issue. But I guess the question was also asked, how will this affect U.S.-China relations, this uncertainty? And of course, at one level, you can say it's none of our business, right? But we can be concerned about things that aren't, quote, our business. And I would say a lot of people that, particularly companies that are thinking about long-term relationships, militaries that have 2 or more decades planning horizon, we feel very much more comfortable with governments in which there is what you might call an institutional succession process. I mean, in a way, you might say the most fundamental thing a government can do is have in place a widely recognized process to move power along with either human mortality or political change in society. And I think what this signals is that, from Deng to Zhang to Hu, we saw the beginning of what we thought were the development of norms. And remember, Britain doesn't have a written constitution. It runs entirely on norms, and it's one of the most stable, modernized countries in the world. So to us, it's partly we feel comfortable with law, but we also can feel comfortable with institutional norms that are widely. So what we see is now an individual coming along that seems to have the capacity, we don't know the will, but the capacity to change the norms. And that almost intrinsically is a less predictable country in our minds. So I think this assumes a great importance, just the mere debate about it. China's, under Mao, what did he go through? 4 successors, including Wang Hongwen, right? And Deng Xiaoping went through 3 before he got to 3 when he got to Jiang Zemin. We thought China was beginning to sort of move in a norm-based direction. And this is raising the issue of, is that accurate or not?
I guess just one thing I would add specifically on U.S.-China trade and investment, I think many of us are waiting to see after this Party Congress this month, will that then set the stage for a refocus on the Chinese economy and putting in place many of the economic reforms that were announced 4 years ago and for one reason or another haven't taken place, although I think the goal, the rebalance of the Chinese economy to promote more consumption rather than investment-driven growth still remains the Chinese government's overriding goal for economic development. And so in some ways, after this month, whether or not President Xi has young people on the standing committee who could potentially be his successor, I think many foreign investors are saying, well, this now, that process will have completed, setting the stage for 5 years or longer of some standing committee members, and then allow the Chinese government to refocus on liberalizations that had been promised. And so many of us are very hopeful we'll be able to see that after this month's Party Congress concludes.
And this will be the last question.
Hi, Paul Huang, reporter for the Epoch Times newspaper. So, Amy, you mentioned during Obama administration's 8 years, there were many commonalities that Obama administration have worked with the Chinese, and I wonder if you could elaborate into what sort of commonalities were there, or other than Paris Climate Change Agreement, perhaps were those security related, were those trade related, or human rights related, and if progress had been made and had been entrenched, how come, like the feeling I got from today's event was it's a common feeling that 1 year into Trump's administration, he could just easily revert all the progress that had been made in the past 8 years. How come that's the case? Thank you.
Well, I think one of those fundamentals that was a tenet of cooperation was through the G20 and with other partners to focus on global governance and supporting global economic growth through the existing mechanisms that existed, the World Trade Organization, promoting trade and investment liberalizations. Although I was still working for the US government a decade ago at USTR when I think we had already said the Doha round is dead, we didn't think that members, large economies in the international community would walk away from the WTO itself, maybe not more liberalization. But I think that was one tenet that obviously President Trump has been very clear in saying he may not want to support the WTO in the future and some of the restrictions that puts on the US system. And I think that's one divergence where the Chinese government, of course, continues to say we support the international system, rules-based order. The WTO is one of the founding principles of that rules-based order. And so, yes, it's amazing to me, too, how quickly things can change. But they have. I think President Trump was very proud his first day in office to back out of TPP, and that really was only his first thing when it came to our American commitments to multilateral and bilateral trade agreements that had been negotiated in the past. And so we'll likely see more of that. I mean, negotiators are right now talking about NAFTA. I think after that it will be chorus, whether there needs to be adjustments to that free trade agreement and what that means for, I think, China and the United States, areas of commonality. I think we absolutely still care about combating terrorism. We care about global health pandemics. But I do think President Trump himself has just said, I'm more interested in bilateral relationships. And a strong relationship with China is something he repeatedly has said he believes in. But that's very different, I think, from how the Obama administration talked about the US and China in the world together.
Very, very brief. I think, generally speaking, and if we judge President Trump's policy based on his campaign rhetoric, it could be a very much different administration. But if we judge from since he came to office, and I think not as bad as people worried about. So it's just in the middle. He changed a lot, for example, about his rhetoric on the US alliance system, NATO. And now it is a very much different policy from what he said. But on the China-US relations, I think from the result of the several dialogues between the top levels and the working levels, I think, generally speaking, not fundamental changes of that. I think that will continue.
Well, I guess I'd like to end on a positive note. You said this is the last question. And that is that we focus a lot on all of the problems, and I think there has been a net deterioration. And I would just say, yes, it's encouraging that President Trump backed off a lot of his initial campaign rhetoric, but it's been ratcheting up the more disappointed he has become in cooperation in other areas. So I think the best thing we can say is this is a very fluid administration, and what you see today may or may not be entirely compatible with in the near-term future. But there are positive things going here. And I want to end on the note of interdependence. We really are financially very interdependent. China's doing things that are contributing to employment in the United States, as well as probably some things that are not contributing to employment. We've cooperated on health issues around the world, Ebola and so forth. I think the United States, on climate change, we got the state of California. It's not changing its policies because of Trump. So part of the strength of our system's its federal system. Not everything gets changed by the president. So yes, I think we need to be concerned in the ways we've talked about, but let's keep in some mind there are some equilibrating mechanisms here.
And one of those mechanisms is education.
Yeah.
And the record number of Chinese students here and American students in China. And of course, this is the growth of understanding is one of the key goals of this institution. And on that cheery note, I'd like to please join in thanking our terrific panelists for a great session.